This is a history of the First Taranaki War of 1860 and 61 with a focus on the events leading up to it and the politics and diplomacy around the war. As such, it isn't really a military history. There are 9 episodes in this series, not counting this introduction. Of these 9, only 2 directly deal with the military aspects of the war itself. Instead, you will hear about the history of Te Ātiawa in Taranaki from the arrival of the New Zealand Company to the start of the conflict, of the response to the war from both Maori and settlers, and a final episode on the peace process after the shooting had ended. So hopefully you will find all of that interesting. When I started on this project, I thought it would be a relatively small thing. I thought that the story of the war in Taranaki had been told before. I just wanted to expand it out and add a little bit more detail to the common story told. But the things that I want to talk about grew and grew until towards the end I realised that I had basically created a new history of the First Taranaki War that didn't actually owe a particularly large amount to any of the work of other historians. In fact, at the time, I realised that if I put all my scripts into a single document, it was longer than any other individual work on the First Taranaki War since the 1870s. I've since trimmed it back a bit, so I'm not sure if that is still true, but it will still be up there. But this has led to a problem that I really regret, which is that at the start I didn't bother to properly keep track of my sources. I was assuming that I wouldn't be saying anything controversial or really providing anything new, so there was no need to cite my sources since basically every historian would agree with me. But then I did go on to say a lot of things that don't make it into other histories and perhaps a few things that might be controversial, and I haven't saved the sources to back those claims up. So as you can imagine, I'm kicking myself, and if I make another history series, I won't be making the same mistake. But unfortunately, this time I have. My attempt at fixing this is that I've gone through and found the source documents for the direct quotes that I've used, so that you might at least get an idea of the sources I was using. There is one exception to this though. Towards the end you will see references to parliamentary papers. These are quotes that I found in the official correspondence between London and the New Zealand government. Basically, London recorded everything, while New Zealand only recorded what they thought was important. So the complete record of these communications is held in London, where it is incompletely digitised and horribly organised. I did, however, manage to find the relevant documents, read them, copy down a few quotes, but then I lost the link and I've not been able to find them again. So, apologies, but I can't source documents for a few of the quotes. So that is the major thing I'm hating myself for doing. But there were also a few decisions I made that some might object to that I figure I'll bring up now. Firstly, I've kept the quotes as they were written, and I have not modernised them. The major difficulty with this is finding a balance between 19th century racism and 21st century trying not to be racist. I decided to draw the line at the term savage, but anything worse than that, I simply did not use the quote. Which in some ways is regrettable. For example, there was a future New Zealand Prime Minister who left an account of his participation in the Battle of Waireka. However, it is almost impossible to find a sentence without a racist slur, so none of his account makes it in. On the Maori side of things, you will often find that the quotes are kind of weird sounding. This is because I've decided to use contemporary translations rather than more modern ones. In the 19th century, people tried to capture what they perceived the language to sound like in their translations. And since Europeans generally considered Maori to be a perfect example of the noble savage, a people that were primitive technologically, but very proud and with a high standard of morality, Te Reo was often translated into slightly archaic and quite formal English. For example, the 19th century translation of Tenakwe is usually salutations, and there's also a lot of words like hearken and so on. I did this partly because it saved me the work of trying to find someone to translate these for me, and partly because I thought it was more instructive to include the translations that the Pākehā were working with at the time. The only downside is it just sounds a bit weird. Also, 2 more things are representing Te Reo in the series. I swung back and forth on the amount I would include in these videos. I generally include a bit in my writings, although very little in my speech. However, for a time I toned this down a bit because everything that gets put online is mostly accessed by foreigners, and I wanted them to be able to understand what was happening. So the quantity of te reo words varies, but it's never huge throughout this series. The other issue is the use of macrons. Basically, I've macroned words when I know they have long vowels, but long vowels were not commonly macroned until very recently. Even the Taranaki report of the Waitangi Tribunal, published in 1997, doesn't use macrons. Which means that a lot of the words I use, names in particular, probably need them at some point, but because the historical sources don't include them, I'm not aware of that. So generally I use macrons when I know the word is supposed to, but I'm bound to get them wrong quite often. Not sure you'll be able to hear the difference, but I intend to put the scripts down in the comments so you'll be able to read where I've got them wrong. I would also like to mention that I never came up with a consistent terminology for some of the organisations in this history. On the Maori side, there is bound to be confusion between Taranaki, the location, Taranaki, the iwi, and the various iwi living in the Taranaki location. I've tried to solve the last two by saying Taranaki iwi, or the iwi Taranaki, versus the iwi of Taranaki, or simply having a list of the different iwi involved. But I understand this is confusing, and I'm sure that I haven't followed my own rule at times. For the Pākehā side, I think the main issue comes when distinguishing between the governor and the government, and also the different parts of the government. For example, I will usually call British soldiers imperial if I am discussing them alone, while militia and volunteers I'll call settlers. And if I'm describing settler and imperial forces together, I'll generally use colonial or government forces. Hopefully this will be clear in the context, but again, blame me if there's any confusion. I'd also like to use this introduction video to briefly discuss how government worked in the 1850s. It isn't something people are likely to understand, but it's important to know, and it really didn't fit in anywhere else. As I'm sure you all know, the Treaty of Waitangi was signed in 1840, which allowed the British to set up a government in New Zealand. Initially, this was simply the Governor of New Zealand, who was appointed by the Secretary of State for the Colonies in London, and anyone the Governor appointed under him. However, by 1856 this had expanded so that there were now two levels of democratic government as well. The provincial governments were more involved in people's everyday lives, but are not hugely relevant for this history. What is important though is Parliament, which was located in Auckland at this time. The House of Representatives was directly elected every 5 years by eligible voters who were almost entirely Pākehā, and was the most important part of Parliament. But there was also a Legislative Council whose members were appointed by the Governor for lifelong terms and generally did very little. Collectively, these two chambers wrote legislation and held the government to account. The government in this period was also different from what we're used to today. The chief institution was the Executive Council, which was made up of people appointed by both the Governor and the House of Representatives. The Constitution Act limited the powers of Parliament and reserved some powers for the Governor. The Governor was wholly responsible for defence, relations with other colonies, and Maori affairs, while he had to act on Parliament's advice in all other areas. Particularly note that finance was reserved for Parliament. The Executive Council reflected this breakdown of power, with the Governor appointing people to represent the military and Maori affairs departments, while Parliament chose a number of people to represent other areas of expertise. This was long before political parties existed in New Zealand, and so the people appointed by Parliament to serve on the Executive Council often changed rapidly as members of Parliament became disgruntled with their performance. In 1856, Henry Sewell formed a government and became New Zealand's first Prime Minister, although at that time the office was called Colonial Secretary. However, he lasted less than a month before his government lost a vote of no confidence, and he was replaced by William Fox, who managed to remain in power for 14 days before Edward Stafford managed to take the top job from him. Which, by the way, makes Stafford the youngest Prime Minister in New Zealand history. He beats out Jacinda by a few weeks. Anyway, Stafford managed to keep the government together for a few years, and he is the colonial secretary through most of this history, although he was out of the country for some key events. Now, it's worth bringing up a few important issues with how this government was structured. Firstly, it is worth noting that Maori affairs had two distinct aspects in the 1850s. Firstly, was protecting the rights of Maori people, and secondly, purchasing land off Maori to allow for further European settlement. These were obviously at odds with each other, and the solution found was to have two separate departments responsible for one aspect each. These were the Native Secretary's Office and the Native Land Purchase Office, one led by a Native Secretary and the other by the Native Land Commissioner, both of whom appointed assistants in the various provinces of New Zealand. However, there was a problem with this as well. Remember that the settler-elected parliament controls the government's finances, and so could effectively pour money into purchasing land while not funding efforts to protect Maori rights. This was figured out very early on, and the solution was to effectively re-merge the two departments by appointing Donald Maclean as the head of both organisations, allowing him to direct some of the work from the poorly funded Native Secretaries to the well-funded Land Commissioners. Unfortunately, this was far from an ideal solution, and meant that often one person was present trying to do both roles. In Taranaki in 1859, Robert Paris was the Assistant Land Commissioner and Henry Hulse was the Assistant Native Secretary, although Paris is often given both titles since he largely performed both roles. You'll see how this turned out in a few episodes' time. It's also finally worth mentioning that Parliament was not happy that Maori affairs were out of their power. Stafford went so far as to appoint a Native Affairs Minister, who, despite having no actual power, sat on the Executive Council and made sure to advise the Governor on Maori matters. I think that's enough on how the Pākehā government worked at this time. Maori government was surprisingly consistent across the country, considering that most hapu were essentially independent, although the iwi was growing in significance as unit of political organisation. Essentially, there was usually a runanga or council, whose membership was somewhat fluid, but was made up of the people with the most mana in the hapu, which mana could be acquired through both a person's ancestry or their actions or expertise. This runanga would discuss issues until a consensus was reached, and this would be propagated amongst the hapu with the collective authority of the members of the runanga. There was no method of enforcing the will of the runanga, since the rules of tapu were fading as Christianity was becoming the dominant religion, but it wasn't usually required that the decisions were enforced. For decision-making across tribal lines, the runanga was basically replicated in a hui or meeting. These hui in this time period were often quite large. They commonly lasted for a week or more, and consensus was not always reached, although the majority position would sometimes generate a document that could be signed by those that agree. The Kingitanga or King movement is the last Maori institution that needs to be discussed. This institution was founded as the war in Taranaki started. The story of its founding is told elsewhere, so I won't be going into detail. In short, a number of Maori wanted to have their own king who could represent their collective interests in dealing with the government, the idea being that Maori would be better able to protect their interests if they were all united. The initial trouble was finding a person willing to be king, and years were spent holding hui only to have all the potential candidates say that they were unwilling and suggest somebody else for the role. Eventually, a hui managed to agree on Potato Te Wherewhero from Ngāti Mahuta of Waikato Tainui as king. This was in large part because he had fallen off his horse while crossing a stream on the way to the hui, so he was not present to reject the offer. The real driving force behind the raising up of Potato would soon come from Willamu Tamihana of Ngāti Hawa, who had approached the governor on giving Maori the right to vote, but the governor had snubbed him, and so instead he had put his efforts behind the king movement. Tamihana convinced Ngāti Hawa and Ngāti Maniapoto to support Potato, who then agreed to the role, at which point most of Waikato also agreed to his appointment as king. Again, Potato did not have any tools to enforce his will as king. He instead relied on consensus and his own moral authority to set the direction of the Kingitanga. The governance of the King movement at that time was similar to that of the smaller units of Maori society. There was a runanga. It was basically the runanga of Ngāti Mahuta, with the leaders of other iwi being allowed to attend. Te Wetini from Ngāti Hawa in particular was a regular attendee, and he usually acted as the secretary for the Kingitanga. Alongside the runanga, the Kingitanga held regular hui to discuss events and gauge the opinion of the wider movement. Ngaruawahia was often stated to be the capital of the King movement, as this was the traditional centre of Ngāti Mahuta, and Potato had moved there after he became king. But these hui were held elsewhere in the Waikato as well. So that's what I wanted to say about how governments work. Hopefully it gives you a basic understanding of what these institutions are and what they are doing. The final point I want to discuss in this introduction is that I don't really go deep into the morality of the events that occurred. It is impossible to justify the actions of the government in the lead up to the war, and I also feel the same way about some of the things that people did during the war. However, my interest is in what happened in the past and why it happened, and I actually just don't have a lot of interest in apportioning blame to various people for the ways things turned out. Of course, I'm sure that many people who watch these videos will take a different view, and that's fine. But anyway, that's enough of an introduction for me. These videos will be very visual light, so don't feel obliged to sit down and watch them all. They're really designed for background listening. But regardless, I hope you find them interesting, and hopefully you might learn something about New Zealand's history.